The pre-dawn streets of Charleston held the kind of silence that only came after violence. Kieran Drake stepped out of the warehouse, his knuckles still tender from the collection work that had taken most of the night. Blood stained his white shirt, though none of it was his own. The debtor would think twice before missing another payment to the Torino family. He pulled out his phone to check the time. 5:30 in the morning. The sun wouldn't rise for another hour, but already he could feel the humidity that would make this September day unbearable. Charleston never slept, but it dozed fitfully in these early hours when honest people stayed in their beds and men like him finished their dirty work. Kieran had been doing this job for 8 years now, ever since he'd aged out of the foster system with nothing but rage and the kind of survival instincts that made him useful to dangerous men. The Torino family had given him purpose, structure, and enough money to live well. All they asked in return was his complete loyalty and his willingness to hurt people who crossed them. It was a fair trade, he'd always thought. He had no family to worry about, no conscience to keep him awake at night. Violence came naturally to him, as easy as breathing. The men he hurt deserved it, and if they didn't, well, that wasn't his concern. He followed orders, collected his pay, and went home to his empty apartment where no one waited for him. Do any of you live in South Carolina? I grew up in Charleston, and there's something about these quiet morning streets that stays with you forever. The way the Spanish moss hangs like ghosts in the lamplight. The smell of the harbor mixing with magnolia blossoms. It's beautiful and dangerous at the same time, kind of like the people who call it home. Kieran was walking toward his car when he heard it. A small voice, barely more than a whisper, cutting through the humid air like a knife through silk. Sir, my mom didn't wake up. He stopped walking, turned around slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun tucked into his waistband. In his world, unexpected voices in dark places usually meant trouble. But when he looked down, he saw something that made his blood run cold for reasons he couldn't understand. A little girl stood behind him on the cracked sidewalk. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with tangled dark hair and enormous brown eyes that held too much fear for someone so small. She wore a pink nightgown that had seen better days, and her tiny feet were bare against the rough pavement. She looked up at him with the kind of desperate hope that belonged in fairy tales, not on the streets of Charleston at dawn. Everything about her was wrong for this place, this time, this moment. Children like her should have been safely tucked into warm beds, not wandering alone through neighborhoods where men like him did terrible things in the shadows. Sir, she said again, and her voice cracked with exhaustion and terror. My mom didn't wake up. I shook her and shook her, but she won't wake up and I don't know what to do. Kieran stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He'd killed 3 men tonight. His clothes were splattered with blood, and his hands were still swollen from breaking bones. He was everything parents warned their children about, the monster that lived in closets and under beds. And yet this tiny girl had approached him like he might be her salvation. Something twisted in his chest, something he hadn't felt in so long he'd forgotten it existed. It might have been his conscience, stirring to life after years of careful burial. Or maybe it was just the shock of seeing something so innocent and vulnerable in a world that had taught him both were weaknesses to be exploited. He should walk away. That was the smart choice, the safe choice. Getting involved with civilians was against every rule he lived by. The Torino family didn't pay him to play hero, and attachments were dangerous in his line of work. Men who cared about things other than money and survival didn't last long. But looking down at her tear-streaked face, he found he couldn't move. She was so small, so completely defenseless. If he walked away now, what would happen to her? Who else would she find to help her in this neighborhood at this hour? The thought of her approaching someone with fewer scruples than him made his stomach turn. Where do you live? He asked, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. He'd spent so many years speaking only in threats and commands that kindness felt foreign on his tongue. She pointed down the street with one tiny hand, toward a row of run-down apartments that had seen better decades. It's the yellow one, she whispered, with the broken steps. Mama's in bed and she's really hot, but she won't wake up no matter how loud I yell. Kieran felt his heart rate spike. A fever that wouldn't break, unconsciousness, a child left alone and desperate enough to seek help from strangers. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd seen enough sick people in his 31 years to recognize the signs of something serious. He should call 911 and walk away. Let the professionals handle it while he disappeared back into the shadows where he belonged. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't do it. This little girl had looked at him and seen someone worth trusting, someone who might help instead of hurt. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at him that way. "Show me," he said quietly. She nodded and turned to lead him down the street, her small hand slipping into his without hesitation. The simple trust of that gesture hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had touched him without fear or calculation? When had anyone ever needed him for something other than violence? They walked together through the empty streets, an unlikely pair that would have made no sense to anyone watching. The deadly enforcer and the frightened child, her tiny fingers wrapped around his blood-stained hand like he was her lifeline instead of her potential destroyer. The apartment building she led him to was exactly what he'd expected. Paint peeling from the walls, windows cracked or boarded up, the kind of place where people lived when they'd run out of better options. The steps leading to the second floor were indeed broken, with pieces of concrete scattered around the base like broken teeth. "This way," she whispered, tugging him up the unstable staircase. Her apartment was at the end of a dim hallway that smelled like cigarettes and despair. The door was standing open, and Kieran felt his professional paranoia spike. No one left their door open in a neighborhood like this unless something was very wrong. The little girl led him through a living room that was sparse but clean, past a kitchen where dishes sat neatly in the drying rack. For all their obvious poverty, someone had been trying to make this place a home. Toys were scattered across the carpet, and children's drawings hung on the refrigerator with careful precision. "Mama's in here," the girl said, pulling him toward a small bedroom at the back of the apartment. Kieran stepped through the doorway and felt his breath catch. A young woman lay motionless on the narrow bed, her face flushed with fever and her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. She was probably in her mid-20s, with the same dark hair as her daughter and delicate features that would have been pretty if not for the obvious illness ravaging her system. Even unconscious, she radiated the kind of exhausted fragility that spoke of too many burdens carried by shoulders too small to bear them. This was someone who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts for a long time, and losing more often than she won. "How long has she been like this?" he asked the little girl, who had climbed onto the bed and was gently stroking her mother's hair. "Since yesterday morning," she answered in a voice that was too matter-of-fact for someone her age. "She got really hot, and then she fell down in the kitchen, and I couldn't wake her up. I gave her water and tried to make her eat crackers, but she won't open her eyes." Kieran moved closer to the bed, close enough to see the woman's labored breathing and feel the heat radiating from her fevered skin. She was burning up, and from the sound of her breathing, fluid was building in her lungs. Pneumonia, most likely, and serious enough that waiting any longer could be fatal. He pulled out his phone without thinking, his fingers already dialing 911 before his rational mind could object. He might be a killer, but he wasn't going to let an innocent woman die from treatable illness while her daughter watched. "What are you doing?" the little girl asked, her eyes wide with new fear. "Getting help for your mama," he said simply. "She needs a doctor, and she needs one right now." As he waited for the emergency operator to answer, Kieran found himself looking around the small bedroom with new eyes. This wasn't just poverty. This was poverty with dignity. The sheets were clean despite being worn thin, and children's books were stacked neatly on a makeshift nightstand. Someone had been fighting hard to build a life here, to create something beautiful in the midst of circumstances that offered very little hope. The little girl was still stroking her mother's hair, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay now that the nice man was here to help. Her faith in him was both humbling and terrifying. He was many things, but nice had never been one of them. Yet looking at her small face, seeing the relief in her eyes now that she wasn't carrying this burden alone, he felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been frozen for so long he'd forgotten it existed was starting to thaw, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what that might mean. The 911 operator finally answered, and Kieran found himself giving the address and explaining the situation with a calmness that surprised him. He'd called ambulances before, usually for people he'd hurt rather than people he wanted to help. This felt different. This felt like the first decent thing he'd done in years. When he hung up the phone, the little girl was looking at him with such gratitude that his throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for helping us." "What's your name?" he asked, settling onto the edge of the bed beside her. "Ivy," she said, "and that's my mama, Celeste. She takes really good care of me, but sometimes she gets sick, and then I have to take care of her instead." The simple acceptance in her voice broke something inside him. This child had been carrying responsibilities no 4-year-old should know existed, and she'd been doing it with the kind of quiet courage that put his own self-pity to shame. The ambulance arrived within minutes, bringing with it a flurry of activity and questions that Kieran answered as best he could. He wasn't family, he explained to the paramedics, just a neighbor who'd been asked to help. It wasn't entirely a lie, and it was simpler than explaining the truth. They worked quickly and efficiently, starting in 4 and checking Celeste's vitals while Ivy clung to Kieran's hand and watched with eyes too old for her face. "Severe pneumonia," one of the paramedics confirmed. "Another day or two, and it could have been fatal." As they prepared to transport Celeste to the hospital, Ivy looked up at Kieran with panic in her eyes. "What about me?" she whispered. "Can I go with Mama?" "Of course you can," Kieran heard himself saying before anyone else could answer. "I'll make sure of it." He rode with them to the hospital, this strange little family that wasn't his family, watching over them like he had any right to care what happened to either of them. Ivy had fallen asleep against his shoulder during the ride, her tiny hand still clutching his like he was her anchor in a storm. Somewhere between the warehouse and the hospital, between the blood on his hands and the trust in her eyes, Kieran Drake had become someone he didn't recognize. He was still a killer, still a man who lived in the shadows and hurt people for money. But he was also something else now, something he'd never thought he could be. He was someone a little girl could count on, someone who might actually be worth saving. And for the first time in his adult life, that felt like enough. The Charleston General Hospital emergency room buzzed with the controlled chaos that Kieran had seen too many times before, though always from the other side of the equation. Usually he was the reason people ended up here, not the one trying to get them help. The irony wasn't lost on him as he carried a sleeping Ivy through the automatic doors, following the gurney that held her unconscious mother. The fluorescent lights made everything look stark and unforgiving, casting harsh shadows that reminded him uncomfortably of the warehouse he'd left just hours earlier. But instead of the metallic smell of fear and blood, here the air carried the sharp bite of antiseptic and the underlying sweetness of human suffering. It was a different kind of violence, one that healed instead of destroyed. Ivy stirred in his arms as they moved through the corridors, her small body trusting him completely even in sleep. She weighed almost nothing, all bird bones and soft skin, and holding her felt like cradling something infinitely precious and breakable. When was the last time he'd held anything that wasn't a weapon or a threat? When had anyone ever needed him for comfort instead of pain? The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, wheeling Celeste into a treatment room while a nurse directed Kieran and Ivy to a waiting area filled with uncomfortable chairs and magazines that had seen better years. He settled into a corner seat, positioning himself where he could watch the hallways and keep Ivy close. Old habits died hard, and even in a hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that danger might be watching from the shadows. "Sir," the admissions clerk called from behind her desk. "I need to get some information about the patient." Kieran looked down at Ivy, who had woken up and was staring around the busy emergency room with wide, frightened eyes. Everything about this place was designed to overwhelm, from the bright lights to the constant sound of monitors beeping and people talking in urgent voices. For a 4-year-old who'd already been through more trauma than most adults could handle, it had to feel like a nightmare. "Can it wait?" he asked the clerk, his voice carrying just enough edge to make her think twice about pushing. "The little girl needs some time to adjust." The woman looked at him more carefully, taking in his expensive clothes and the way he held himself like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Whatever she saw made her nod quickly and retreat behind her computer screen. Kieran filed that reaction away for future reference. Even covered in blood and carrying a child, he apparently still projected enough menace to make civilians nervous. "Where's Mama?" Ivy whispered, pressing closer against his chest. "She smells funny, and there's lots of noise, and I don't like it here." "The doctors are helping her," Kieran said quietly, surprised by how natural it felt to comfort her. "They're going to make her better, but it might take a little while. Can you be brave for me?" Ivy nodded solemnly, but her small hand clutched at his shirt with desperate strength. "I'm always brave," she said. "Mama says I'm the bravest girl in Charleston." But sometimes it's hard to be brave all by myself. You're not by yourself anymore. He heard himself promise, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. They sat together in the waiting room as the night slowly gave way to morning, watching the controlled chaos of an urban emergency room unfold around them. Kieran found himself studying the other people waiting for news about their loved ones, trying to understand the expressions on their faces. Worry, fear, hope, desperation, emotions he'd spent his adult life avoiding were written across every face in the room. A young nurse approached them after what felt like hours, her scrubs decorated with cheerful cartoon characters that seemed absurdly bright in the harsh hospital lighting. She knelt down in front of Ivy with the kind of practiced gentleness that spoke of years spent dealing with frightened children. "Hi there, sweetie," she said with a warm smile. "My name is Rebecca. Are you Celeste's little girl?" Ivy nodded shyly, still pressed against Kieran's chest. "Is my mama going to be okay?" she asked in a voice so small it was barely audible above the ambient noise of the hospital. "She's going to be just fine," Rebecca assured her. "She's very sick right now, but we're giving her medicine to help her breathe better and bringing her fever down. The doctor says she should start feeling better soon." Relief flooded through Kieran with an intensity that caught him off guard. When had her welfare become so important to him? When had this stranger's recovery started feeling like a matter of life and death? He'd known them for less than 6 hours, but somehow their well-being had become tangled up with his own sense of purpose in ways he didn't understand. "Can we see her?" he asked the nurse, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "In a little while," Rebecca said, her gaze shifting between him and Ivy with obvious curiosity. "The doctor wants to get her stabilized first, but she's responding well to treatment." "Are you family?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. He wasn't family. He wasn't anything to these people except a stranger who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. He had no legal right to be here, no claim on either of them that would hold up under scrutiny. But looking down at Ivy's trusting face, he found he couldn't bring himself to care about technicalities. "I'm taking care of them," he said simply, letting his voice carry enough authority to discourage further questions. Rebecca nodded, apparently deciding that whatever their relationship was, it wasn't her job to define it. She stood up and smoothed down her scrubs, preparing to return to her other patients. "Someone will come get you when you can see her," she promised. "It shouldn't be too much longer." As she walked away, Kieran became aware that other people in the waiting room were staring at them. He supposed they made an odd pair, a dangerous-looking man in expensive clothes holding a small child, like she was his most precious possession. Let them stare. He'd been the subject of unwanted attention his entire life, and their curiosity meant nothing compared to Ivy's need for comfort. "Are you hungry?" he asked her softly. "We could find you something to eat." Ivy considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "A little bit," she admitted. "But I don't have any money, and Mama says we're not supposed to take things we can't pay for." The simple honesty of that statement hit him harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Here was a 4-year-old who'd been taught principles about financial responsibility while he'd been spending more on a single dinner than most families saw in a month. She worried about paying for hospital cafeteria food while he kept enough cash in his wallet to buy the entire building. "Don't worry about money," he told her gently. "I have plenty, and I want to make sure you're taken care of. Your mama would want you to eat something." They made their way through the hospital corridors, Ivy's hand secure in his as she marveled at the size of the building and the number of people moving through it. To her, this was probably the biggest indoor space she'd ever seen, a maze of hallways and rooms that stretched beyond her understanding. To him, it was just another institutional building, sterile and impersonal in the way that all hospitals were. The cafeteria was nearly empty at this early hour, staffed by tired-looking workers who were probably counting down the minutes until their shift ended. Kieran bought Ivy chocolate chip pancakes and orange juice, foods that seemed appropriate for a child, even though he had no experience with what 4-year-olds actually wanted to eat. She attacked the meal with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been too worried to eat properly for days. "This is really good," she said around a mouthful of pancakes. "Mama usually makes me oatmeal because it's cheap and fills you up, but sometimes I wish we could have pancakes instead." Another casual revelation that cut straight through his carefully constructed emotional armor. This child had been living with food insecurity while he'd been throwing money around like it meant nothing. She'd been taking care of her sick mother and worrying about groceries while he'd been concerned with nothing more serious than which expensive restaurant to visit for dinner. "You can have pancakes whenever you want," he found himself saying. "From now on, you don't have to worry about things like that anymore." Ivy looked up at him with syrup on her chin and hope in her eyes. "Really?" she asked. "You mean it?" "I mean it," he confirmed, and realized he'd just made a promise he had no idea how to keep. But looking at her grateful smile, he knew he'd figure it out somehow. This little girl had already changed something fundamental inside him, and there was no going back to the man he'd been before she'd whispered those life-altering words on a dark Charleston street. By the time they returned to the waiting room, Rebecca was looking for them. "Your mama's awake," she told Ivy with a gentle smile. "She's asking for you." They followed the nurse through a maze of corridors to a room that smelled like disinfectant and contained enough medical equipment to stock a small clinic. Celeste was propped up in bed with an oxygen mask covering the lower half of her face, but her eyes were open and alert. When she saw Ivy, those eyes filled with tears of relief and something that looked like shame. Ivy climbed carefully onto the hospital bed, mindful of the tubes and wires connecting her mother to various machines. "Mama," she whispered, pressing her face against Celeste's shoulder. "I was so scared. I thought you weren't going to wake up." Celeste's hand came up to stroke her daughter's hair, the gesture weak but infinitely tender. "I'm sorry, baby," she managed to say through the oxygen mask. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that alone." It was then that her gaze shifted to Kieran, who had remained standing near the door like he wasn't sure he belonged in this moment of family reunion. Her eyes were the same warm brown as Ivy's, but they held a wariness that spoke of hard experience with men who couldn't be trusted. She was evaluating him, trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted from them. Ivy twisted around to look at him, her face lighting up with the kind of uncomplicated joy that children specialized in. "This is the nice man who helped us, Mama," she announced proudly. "He called the ambulance and stayed with me the whole time and bought me pancakes with chocolate chips." Celeste's expression shifted as she took in this information, confusion replacing some of the wariness. She was clearly trying to reconcile the image of a dangerous-looking stranger with someone who would spend hours caring for a frightened child. Kieran could see her mind working, trying to piece together a story that made sense of their presence in her hospital room. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice muffled by the mask, but carrying genuine gratitude. "I don't know how to repay you for what you've done." "You don't need to repay anything," Kieran said quietly. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Nothing about this had been coincidence. Some force larger than chance had put Ivy in his path at the exact moment when both of them needed saving her from a medical emergency that could have been fatal, and him from a life that had been slowly eating away at whatever was left of his soul. The doctor appeared in the doorway, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the sort of competent presence that inspired confidence. She smiled at the family tableau before introducing herself and explaining Celeste's condition in terms that were both honest and reassuring. Severe pneumonia, but caught just in time. A few days of rest and antibiotics, and she should make a complete recovery. The relief in the room was palpable, but Kieran found himself focused on the practical details that nobody else seemed to be considering. Hospital bills, lost wages from missed work, the cost of medications and follow-up care. Celeste was a single mother who'd been barely surviving before this crisis. How was she supposed to handle the additional financial burden of a medical emergency? He made a mental note to speak with the billing department before they left. Money was one problem he could solve easily, and after years of using his resources for destruction, it felt revolutionary to use them for something constructive instead. As the doctor finished her examination and left them alone again, Kieran found himself studying this small family he'd somehow become responsible for. Celeste was beautiful despite her illness, with the kind of quiet strength that came from facing adversity and refusing to break. Ivy was curled against her mother's side like a kitten seeking warmth, finally relaxed now that her world had stopped falling apart. They were strangers to him, people he'd known for less than a day. But watching them together, seeing the love that bound them despite their circumstances, he felt something he'd never experienced before. Not just attraction or protectiveness, but a deep longing to be part of something that mattered. To belong somewhere that wasn't defined by violence and fear. For the first time in his adult life, Kieran Drake wanted to be someone's family. And looking at the trust in Ivy's eyes and the cautious gratitude in Celeste's, he thought maybe, just maybe, they might want him too. 3 days later, Kieran found himself standing outside Celeste's apartment building with grocery bags in both hands, and no clear understanding of how his life had taken such a dramatic turn. The doctor had discharged her that morning with strict instructions for rest and a prescription list that would have bankrupted most families. But money wasn't the issue. The issue was figuring out how to care for people when his only expertise lay in hurting them. He'd spent the previous 2 nights in hotels near the hospital, unwilling to leave Ivy alone even though nurses assured him she was safe. The little girl had attached herself to him with the desperate intensity of someone who'd learned too early that adults could disappear without warning. Every time he tried to step out for coffee or fresh air, she'd panic, convinced he was abandoning her like so many others probably had. The building looked even more depressing in daylight. Paint peeled from the siding like diseased skin, and the broken steps he'd climbed in darkness revealed themselves to be a genuine safety hazard. This was where they called home, where Celeste had been trying to build a life for her daughter on whatever income she could scrape together. The contrast between this place and his penthouse across town felt obscene. Kieran climbed the unstable staircase carefully, balancing the groceries while avoiding the sections that looked ready to collapse entirely. He'd already spoken to his lawyer about buying the building, though he hadn't mentioned that plan to Celeste yet. Some conversations required careful timing, and suggesting he purchase her entire apartment complex might fall into the category of gestures that frightened rather than reassured. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Ivy in pajamas that were too small and a smile that lit up her entire face. "You came back," she said with such relief that his chest tightened painfully. "I told Mama you would, but she said maybe you had other things to do." "I'll always come back," he told her seriously, setting down the groceries so he could crouch to her eye level. "When I make a promise to you, I keep it. Do you understand?" She nodded solemnly, then threw her small arms around his neck with the kind of trust that felt like both a gift and a responsibility too large for him to carry. He hugged her back carefully, still amazed by how natural it felt to hold this tiny person who'd somehow become the most important thing in his world. Celeste appeared in the doorway behind her daughter, moving slowly but under her own power. She'd changed out of the hospital gown into worn jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she had surrounded by medical equipment. Her face was still pale from the illness, but her eyes were alert and watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You didn't have to bring all this," she said, gesturing toward the bags he'd set down in the hallway. "The groceries, I mean. And whatever else is in there." Kieran straightened up, suddenly aware that he probably looked like someone trying to buy his way into their lives. The grocery bags contained enough food to feed a family of 6 for a month, plus medications, vitamins, and various items he'd thought Ivy might enjoy. Looking at it through Celeste's eyes, he could see how it might seem overwhelming rather than helpful. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he said carefully. "The doctor said you should take it easy for at least a week, and I thought it would be easier if you didn't have to worry about shopping or cooking." That was a reasonable explanation, though it didn't come close to capturing the truth. The truth was that he'd spent 2 hours in the grocery store, overwhelmed by choices and desperately trying to imagine what a normal family might need. He'd asked the clerk for help, claiming he was shopping for his sister, and ended up buying everything she suggested plus several items that had made Ivy smile during their hospital cafeteria visits. "Come in," Celeste said after a moment, stepping aside to let him pass. "But we need to talk about this arrangement, whatever it is. I appreciate everything you've done, more than I can express, but I don't understand what you want from us." It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd decided to help them. What did he want from a struggling single mother and her 4-year-old daughter? What possible use could they be to someone whose life revolved around violence and criminal enterprise? The honest answer was that he wanted to belong somewhere. He wanted to wake up in the morning with a purpose that went beyond collecting debts and intimidating enemies. He wanted to be the kind of man that Ivy already believed him to be, someone strong enough to protect the people he cared about, gentle enough to be trusted with their hearts. But explaining that to Celeste would require admitting truths about himself that he wasn't ready to voice. So instead, he carried the groceries into her small kitchen and began unpacking them while she watched from the doorway with growing bewilderment. You bought organic milk, she said, pulling out one of the containers. And fresh fruit. Do you know how much this must have cost? Not enough, he said simply. Money isn't an issue for me, Celeste. I have more than I know what to do with, and spending it on things that matter feels like the first worthwhile thing I've done with it in years. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. What is it you do for work? She asked finally. I've been wondering since the hospital. You dress expensively, you carry cash, you handle crises like someone who's used to taking charge. But you won't talk about your job. Kieran paused in his unpacking, his hands stilling on a container of yogurt that probably cost more than she usually spent on groceries in a week. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, the moment when he'd have to decide how much truth she could handle. Too little, and she'd never trust him. Too much, and she'd never let him near Ivy again. I work for a family business, he said carefully. Security and problem solving, mostly. It pays well, but it's not always pleasant work. It wasn't technically a lie, though it fell far short of the complete truth. The Torino family was indeed a family business, and he did solve their security problems. He just solved them with his fists and occasionally with weapons, using methods that would horrify most decent people. Celeste nodded slowly, accepting his explanation even though he could see the questions still lingering in her eyes. She was smart enough to recognize evasion when she heard it, but also practical enough to know that pushing for details might cost her the help she desperately needed. Ivy appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sound of rustling bags and adult conversation. She'd changed into regular clothes, but kept her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, a security blanket that had seen better days but was clearly precious beyond measure. Did you bring me something? She asked hopefully, looking at Kieran with the kind of expectant joy that made him want to buy her everything in every store in Charleston. I might have found a few things I thought you'd like, he admitted, pulling out a small bag from behind the cereal boxes. But only if your mama says it's okay. Celeste looked between them, seeing the connection that had formed during those long hospital hours when he'd been the only stable presence in Ivy's frightening world. Whatever reservations she had about accepting help from a stranger, she couldn't deny that her daughter had bonded with him in a way that seemed to fulfill some deep need for security and masculine protection. What kind of things? She asked cautiously. Kieran opened the bag to reveal a collection of items that had seemed reasonable in the store, but now felt potentially overwhelming. New pajamas in Ivy's size, a picture book about brave princesses, crayons and coloring books, and a small teddy bear that had reminded him of her beloved rabbit. Ivy gasped with delight, her eyes going wide as she took in the unexpected treasures. For me, she whispered, like she couldn't quite believe such good fortune was possible. For you, Kieran confirmed, feeling his heart do something complicated in his chest when she launched herself at his legs and hugged him with fierce gratitude. Over her head, he met Celeste's gaze and saw a complex mixture of emotions there. Gratitude, certainly, but also wariness and something that might have been the beginning of attraction. She was a woman who'd learned to be suspicious of men bearing gifts, but she was also a mother who couldn't ignore her daughter's happiness. Thank you, she said quietly, for all of this, but I need you to understand that we can't keep accepting charity indefinitely. I have to work. I have to take care of us myself. That's just who I am. I understand, he said, and meant it. Independence was obviously important to her, part of what had kept her and Ivy afloat when circumstances would have destroyed someone weaker. He didn't want to take that away from her, just provide a safety net while she rebuilt her strength. What if we called it a loan, he suggested. You can pay me back when you're able to work again. And in the meantime, maybe I could help with some of the practical things. Grocery shopping, driving you to doctor appointments, watching Ivy when you need to rest. Celeste considered this proposal while Ivy explored her new treasures on the kitchen floor, chattering happily to her stuffed animals about the nice man who brought presents. The domestic scene felt surreal to Kieran, like stepping into a life that belonged to someone else entirely. What's in it for you? Celeste asked bluntly. I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but men don't usually go to these lengths for strangers without expecting something in return. It was another fair question, and this time he tried to give her an honest answer. Your daughter saved my life, he said simply. Not literally, but in every way that matters. I've been sleepwalking through my existence for years, doing work that means nothing and going home to an empty apartment every night. Then Ivy looked at me like I might be worth trusting, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to be human. The truth of that statement surprised even him. He hadn't planned to be so revealing, but something about Celeste's direct gaze and the domestic warmth of her small kitchen made honesty feel possible in a way it never had before. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words while watching Ivy arrange her new crayons in careful rows. When she looked back at him, some of the wariness had faded from her expression, replaced by something that looked like understanding. "1 week," she said finally. "You can help us for 1 week while I get my strength back. After that, we'll reevaluate based on how things are going. And I pay you back eventually, every penny." Kieran nodded, accepting her terms even though he had no intention of ever collecting repayment. 1 week would be enough to prove that he could be trusted, that his presence in their lives was beneficial rather than disruptive. After that, he'd find ways to extend the arrangement for as long as they'd let him stay. That evening, he found himself in the unfamiliar position of helping prepare dinner in someone else's kitchen. Celeste had insisted on cooking despite his offers to order takeout, claiming she needed to feel useful after days of being waited on in the hospital. So instead, he'd been assigned the task of keeping Ivy entertained while her mother worked. It should have been awkward, playing with a 4-year-old in a cramped apartment that smelled like poverty and determination. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing he'd ever done. Ivy showed him how to color inside the lines, taught him the names of all her stuffed animals, and explained the complex social dynamics of her toy kingdom with the seriousness of a diplomat negotiating international treaties. "You're really good with her," Celeste observed from the stove, where she was stirring something that smelled infinitely better than anything he'd eaten in months. "She's easy to be good with," he replied, helping Ivy arrange her animals in what she claimed was proper sleeping order. "She's the bravest person I've ever met." It was true. This tiny girl had approached a dangerous stranger on a dark street because her mother needed help, had spent 3 days in a hospital without breaking down, and was now treating him like family simply because he'd proven himself trustworthy. That kind of resilience and capacity for love put his own emotional limitations to shame. Dinner was a revelation. Not the food, though Celeste's simple pasta and vegetables tasted better than meals he'd eaten at 5-star restaurants. The revelation was the experience of sitting around a small table with people who wanted him there, sharing conversation that had nothing to do with business or violence or the complex strategies required to survive in his usual world. Ivy chattered about her favorite books and the games she wanted to play tomorrow. Celeste asked careful questions about his interests and opinions, slowly building a picture of who he was beyond his mysterious job and expensive clothes. And Kieran found himself talking about things he'd never shared with anyone: his love of old movies, his secret fascination with architecture, his childhood dreams before foster care had taught him that survival mattered more than hopes. By the time they'd finished eating and cleaned up the dishes, something had shifted in the small apartment. The polite distance that had characterized their interactions was giving way to something warmer, more comfortable. When Ivy curled up against his side during her bedtime story, it felt natural. When Celeste smiled at him over her daughter's head, it felt like coming home. Later, after Ivy had been tucked into bed and was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, Kieran prepared to leave for his hotel. He'd taken 1 step toward the door when Celeste's voice stopped him. "The couch pulls out into a bed," she said quietly. "If you wanted to stay. I know Ivy would sleep better knowing you're here, and honestly, I would too." It was an offer that meant more than she probably realized. Trust, from a woman who'd learned to be careful about trusting. An invitation to belong, even temporarily, to something that felt like family. Kieran looked around the small living room with its mismatched furniture and children's drawings taped to the walls, and knew he'd never wanted anything more than to be allowed to stay in this place that felt more like home than anywhere he'd ever lived. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Thank you." As he settled onto the couch that night, listening to the quiet sounds of people sleeping safely nearby, Kieran Drake realized that his life had just changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in the criminal underworld of Charleston, his absence from usual business was probably being noticed and discussed. Questions would be asked, assumptions would be made, and eventually, someone would decide that his new priorities represented either a weakness to exploit or a threat to eliminate. But lying there in the darkness, surrounded by the warmth of a family that had somehow become his to protect, he found he didn't care about the dangers that might be gathering in the shadows. For the first time in his adult life, he had something worth fighting for that went beyond mere survival. And he would do whatever it took to keep it safe. 2 weeks into what Celeste still called their temporary arrangement, Kieran's phone rang during breakfast with a sound that made his blood run cold. The ringtone belonged to Vincent Torino, head of the family that employed him, and Vincent didn't call to chat about the weather. When your boss in organized crime wanted to talk, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Kieran glanced across the small kitchen table where Ivy was carefully arranging her cereal into patterns while Celeste read the morning paper with the kind of peaceful concentration he'd never experienced in his previous life. This domestic scene felt precious and fragile, like something that could shatter if he breathed wrong or made the kind of choices his old life demanded. "I need to take this," he said quietly, stepping onto the fire escape that served as the apartment's only private outdoor space. Vincent's voice carried the smooth menace that had made him successful in a business where weakness was often fatal. "Kieran, my friend, you've been hard to reach lately. Important work has been piling up while you've been playing house with civilians." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Kieran had been ignoring calls, postponing meetings, and delegating responsibilities that Vincent expected him to handle personally. For 8 years, he'd been the family's most reliable enforcer, the man they sent when situations required both intelligence and controlled violence. Now he was spending his evenings reading bedtime stories instead of breaking bones for overdue debts. "I've been dealing with a personal situation," Kieran said carefully. "It required my immediate attention, but it's under control now." "Personal situations," Vincent repeated with the kind of soft laugh that meant someone was about to receive a painful education about priorities. "You don't have personal situations, Kieran. You have work, and you have whatever time is left over after work is finished. Those civilians you've been protecting are making you soft, making you forget who you really are." The words hit their target because they contained enough truth to hurt. Kieran had been changing, becoming someone gentler and more careful about the violence he inflicted on the world. But instead of feeling ashamed of that transformation, he found himself angry that Vincent saw it as weakness rather than growth. "I haven't forgotten anything," he said with an edge that would have warned most people to back down. But Vincent Torino hadn't built a criminal empire by backing down from confrontation. "Good," Vincent said smoothly. "Then you'll have no problem handling the situation that's developed while you've been absent. Marcus Reed has been late with his payments again, and this time his excuses aren't good enough. I need you to remind him what happens when people take our generosity for granted." Kieran knew Marcus Reed, a small-time business owner who'd borrowed money from the family to keep his restaurant afloat during the pandemic. The man had been struggling to make payments, but he'd been trying, sending whatever he could afford along with apologetic explanations about supply chain issues and staff shortages. Under normal circumstances, Kieran would have handled this with the kind of measured violence that encouraged compliance without creating unnecessary enemies. But standing on a fire escape outside an apartment where a 4-year-old girl trusted him to be the kind of man who brought safety instead of harm, the thought of hurting someone who was merely struggling to survive made his stomach turn. When had his conscience become so inconveniently active? "I'll handle it," he said finally, knowing that refusing would create problems he wasn't ready to deal with. "But I'll do it my way on my timeline." "Of course," Vincent agreed, but his tone carried a warning. "Just remember that our reputation depends on consistency. People need to know that borrowing from us comes with consequences when payments are missed. I trust you haven't forgotten how to deliver that message effectively." The call ended with promises to reconnect soon and implicit threats about the consequences of continued neglect of duties. Kieran stood on the fire escape for several minutes afterward, looking out over the Charleston skyline and trying to reconcile the man Vincent expected him to be with the man Ivy called Daddy and Celeste was slowly learning to trust. When he returned to the kitchen, both women in his life were watching him with expressions that suggested they'd overheard enough to be concerned. Ivy's face showed the kind of worry that no 4-year-old should have to carry, while Celeste looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle with several missing pieces. "Is everything okay?" Celeste asked quietly. "You look like someone just delivered bad news." "Work complications," Kieran said, which was true enough even if it didn't capture the full scope of the problem. "Nothing I can't handle," but I might need to take care of some business today. Ivy's face fell with disappointment that cut straight through his chest. But you promised we'd go to the park, she said. You said we could feed the ducks and play on the swings. And we will, he assured her quickly, crouching down so they were at eye level. I just need to handle one thing first, and then I'll have the rest of the day free for park adventures. Does that sound fair? She nodded solemnly, accepting his promise with the kind of trust that made him want to be worthy of it. But Celeste continued watching him with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand that his mysterious work might be more complicated than simple security consulting. After breakfast, when Ivy was occupied with her coloring books, Celeste approached him with the kind of direct honesty he'd learned to expect from her. Whatever you do for work, she said quietly, it's dangerous, isn't it? And probably not entirely legal. Kieran considered lying, crafting another carefully vague explanation that would satisfy her curiosity without forcing him to admit the full truth. But looking into her intelligent brown eyes, he found himself tired of deception. This woman had trusted him with her daughter and her home. She deserved better than his continued evasion. Yes, he said simply. It's both of those things. I work for people who solve problems that can't be handled through conventional channels, and sometimes that requires methods that would make you uncomfortable. Celeste was quiet for a long moment, processing this confirmation of what she'd probably suspected for days. Are you going to hurt someone today? She asked finally, her voice steady but her hands betraying her nervousness by fidgeting with her coffee cup. I'm going to try very hard not to, he said honestly. But the man I work for expects certain results, and I can't guarantee that reason alone will be enough to achieve them. The honesty felt both liberating and terrifying. For weeks, he'd been living a double life, trying to compartmentalize his roles as criminal enforcer and makeshift family man. But standing in Celeste's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd been building together, he realized that such compartmentalization was ultimately unsustainable. Either he would have to choose between these worlds, or find a way to bridge them that didn't compromise the people he'd grown to love. Why do you do it? Celeste asked. The work, I mean. You're obviously intelligent, capable of running legitimate businesses. Why choose something that puts you in danger and forces you to hurt people? The question struck at the heart of issues he'd been avoiding for years. Why did he continue working for Vincent when he had enough money saved to live comfortably without criminal income? Why had he never seriously considered leaving a life that offered violence and isolation instead of the connection and purpose he'd found in this small apartment? Because it's what I know, he said finally. I grew up in foster care, bounced between families that saw me as a paycheck rather than a person. By the time I aged out at 18, I had no education, no connections, no legal way to make the kind of money that would guarantee I'd never be powerless again. The Torino family gave me purpose and protection when no one else would. It was more honesty than he'd shared with anyone in years, but something about Celeste's expression encouraged him to continue. She wasn't judging him, just trying to understand the forces that had shaped his choices. And now, he added quietly, I have something worth protecting that goes beyond my own survival. But walking away from this life isn't as simple as submitting a resignation letter. People like Vincent don't accept retirement gracefully, especially when their employees know too much about family business. Celeste moved closer, her hand touching his arm with the kind of careful comfort he was still learning to accept. We'll figure it out, she said softly. Whatever it takes to keep us all safe, we'll figure it out together. The simple promise hit him with unexpected force. We, together. Words that implied a future where his problems were their problems, where the family they'd been building was strong enough to survive external pressures. When had anyone ever offered to face his battles alongside him rather than abandoning him to fight alone? Kieran left for his meeting with Marcus Reed, carrying the memory of Celeste's touch and the knowledge that he was no longer fighting only for himself. The restaurant was located in a part of town that had seen better decades, surrounded by the kind of businesses that struggled to survive on hope and determination rather than adequate capital. Marcus was exactly what Kieran had expected, a middle-aged man who'd probably worked 16-hour days for years trying to build something meaningful for his family. His restaurant was clean but dated, filled with the kind of personal touches that spoke of genuine pride in his work. This wasn't someone who'd borrowed money for gambling or drugs. This was a man trying to save a legitimate business that meant everything to him. The conversation that followed was unlike any collection work Kieran had done in his 8 years with the Torino family. Instead of intimidation and threats, he found himself listening to Marcus explain his situation with the kind of patience he'd never shown debtors before. Supply costs had tripled, reliable staff was impossible to find, and customers were still hesitant to dine out regularly despite the pandemic's official end. "I'm not trying to avoid my obligations," Marcus said with the dignity of someone who'd always paid his debts before circumstances overwhelmed him. "I just need a little more time to get back on my feet. Business is starting to improve, but slowly." Looking at this decent man who reminded him uncomfortably of the person he might have become under different circumstances, Kieran made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. He offered Marcus a payment plan that would satisfy Vincent's requirements while giving the restaurant owner a realistic chance of success. And when Marcus mentioned needing a small loan to fix his broken freezer, Kieran provided it from his own money rather than involving family business. The entire interaction took less than an hour, but it represented a fundamental shift in how Kieran approached his work. Violence hadn't been necessary. Threats hadn't been required. Sometimes, he realized, solving problems meant finding solutions rather than creating fear. When he returned to the apartment, Ivy greeted him at the door with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for Christmas morning. "You're back," she announced unnecessarily, launching herself into his arms with complete confidence that he would catch her. "I promised I'd be back for park time," he reminded her, holding her close and marveling at how natural it felt to be someone's safe harbor in a chaotic world. That evening, after Ivy had worn herself out on the playground and fallen asleep during dinner preparations, Kieran found himself alone with Celeste in her small kitchen while something that smelled like heaven simmered on the stove. The domestic intimacy of the moment felt different somehow, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before their morning conversation. "How did it go today?" she asked, not looking at him while she stirred whatever was in the pot. "Your work situation." "Better than expected," he said honestly. "No violence was necessary, and I think everyone involved will be satisfied with the outcome." Celeste turned to face him then, and he saw something in her expression that made his pulse quicken. Relief, certainly, but also something that looked like growing attraction mixed with deepening trust. She was beginning to see him as more than just a temporary protector or charitable benefactor. She was seeing him as a man worth caring about, possibly worth loving. "I'm glad," she said softly. "I was worried all day that your old life would pull you away from us before we'd figured out what this is becoming." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way that demanded an equally honest response. Kieran moved closer, close enough to smell her shampoo and see the way her pulse fluttered at the base of her throat. "Nothing could pull me away from you and Ivy," he said quietly. "This, whatever it is we're building here, is the most important thing in my life. More important than work, more important than money, more important than anything I thought mattered before." When Celeste stepped closer and rose on her toes to kiss him, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Her lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like the coffee she'd been drinking and something essentially feminine that made his head spin. The kiss was gentle, exploratory, nothing like the aggressive encounters that had characterized his previous relationships. When they broke apart, both breathing a little unsteadily, Kieran realized that everything in his life had just shifted again. This wasn't just protection or charity or temporary arrangement anymore. This was love, messy and complicated, and absolutely worth whatever dangers it might bring. But even as they stood there in the warm glow of her kitchen, holding each other like they were afraid the moment might shatter, Kieran couldn't shake the awareness that their happiness existed in a bubble that wouldn't remain intact forever. Somewhere in Charleston, people like Vincent Torino were making decisions about loyalty and liability. And a man who'd been Vincent's most reliable enforcer, suddenly developing civilian attachments would inevitably be seen as either a weakness to exploit or a threat to eliminate. The protection he could offer Celeste and Ivy was substantial, but it wasn't unlimited. Eventually, his two worlds would collide, and when they did, he would have to choose between the life he'd built with them and the life that had made him strong enough to protect them in the first place. For tonight, though, with Celeste's hand in his and Ivy sleeping safely in the next room, those problems could wait. Tonight, he was simply a man who'd found his family and was determined to keep them safe, whatever the cost. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Kieran noticed the black sedan parked across from Celeste's apartment building for the third consecutive day. Different drivers, but the same make and model, positioned where they could monitor everyone coming and going. In his world, surveillance meant someone was gathering intelligence for a purpose that rarely ended well for the targets. He'd been expecting this. 3 weeks of domestic bliss had been borrowed time, a brief reprieve before the consequences of his changing priorities caught up with them. Vincent Torino wasn't the type of man who accepted defiance gracefully, and Kieran's recent absences from family business had clearly been interpreted as exactly that. The confirmation came that afternoon in a phone call that made his blood run cold. An electronically distorted voice delivered a message that was brief and terrifyingly clear. Your new family is very pretty. It would be unfortunate if something happened to them while you continue to neglect your responsibilities. Kieran stood in the grocery store parking lot where he'd been buying ingredients for Ivy's favorite dinner, his hands shaking with a rage so pure it threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational thought. Someone had threatened Celeste and Ivy. Someone had looked at the two most precious people in his world and seen them as leverage to be used against him. He called Vincent immediately, his voice deadly calm despite the fury coursing through his veins. If anyone touches them, he said without preamble, I will burn your entire organization to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. Vincent's laugh was soft and unimpressed. That's quite a threat from someone who's forgotten his place in the natural order. Perhaps you need a reminder about which relationships are permanent and which are temporary conveniences. They're not conveniences, Kieran said, his voice dropping to the lethal whisper that had preceded violence in dozens of previous confrontations. They're my family, and if you think threatening them will bring me back in line, you've miscalculated badly. The line went dead, leaving Kieran alone with the certainty that his worst fears were about to become reality. Vincent had made his choice, and now Kieran would have to make his. There was no middle ground between protecting his family and maintaining his position in the Torino organization. War was coming, and only one side would survive. He drove back to the apartment with his mind already shifting into the tactical mode that had kept him alive through 8 years of dangerous work. First priority was immediate security. The apartment was too exposed, too easy to watch and breach. They needed to relocate somewhere he could control the variables and establish proper defensive positions. Second priority was intelligence gathering. Who was Vincent using for surveillance and potential action? How large was the force being assembled against them? What resources could Kieran call upon from his own network of contacts and obligations? Third priority was elimination of threats. This couldn't end with negotiations or truces. Vincent had made the mistake of threatening innocence, crossing a line that required permanent consequences. Every person involved in this decision would need to be dealt with in a way that discouraged future repetition by others. Celeste took one look at his face when he walked through the door and immediately ushered Ivy into her bedroom with instructions to play quietly while the adults talked. She'd learned to read his expressions over the past weeks, recognizing the difference between work stress and genuine danger. What's happened? She asked quietly once they were alone in the kitchen. Kieran looked at this woman who'd become everything to him, memorizing her face as he prepared to ask her to trust him with decisions that might sound insane to someone unfamiliar with his world. We need to leave, he said simply. Right now, tonight. Pack only essentials and don't tell anyone where we're going. To her credit, Celeste didn't waste time with questions about why or whether he was overreacting. She'd grown up in Charleston, understanding that certain kinds of trouble required immediate action rather than prolonged discussion. Are we in danger? She asked. Yes, he said honestly, but I can keep you safe if you trust me completely and do exactly what I tell you to do. She nodded without hesitation, and that simple gesture of faith hit him harder than any declaration of love could have. This woman was willing to uproot her entire life based on his word alone, trusting that his judgment about danger was worth more than her need for explanations. They packed in 15 minutes, taking only clothes and Ivy's essential comfort items. Kieran had already chosen their destination, a safe house he maintained across town for emergencies, equipped with security systems and defensive advantages that would make any assault prohibitively costly for attackers. The drive took them through parts of Charleston that Celeste probably hadn't seen before, industrial areas where legitimate businesses coexisted with operations that preferred darkness and anonymity. Kieran watched his mirrors constantly, taking a circuitous route that would reveal any surveillance, while giving him opportunities to call ahead and arrange for additional security. The safe house was a converted warehouse that looked unremarkable from the outside, but contained living quarters that were both comfortable and defensible. Steel-reinforced doors, bulletproof windows, and sightlines that allowed defenders to see attackers coming from several blocks away. It wasn't a home, but it was a fortress. "This is where you live?" Ivy asked as they carried their bags inside. "It's different from your other place. This is where we're staying for a little while," Kieran explained, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see the full scope of the main room. "Just until some grown-up problems get sorted out. Think of it as an adventure." Ivy accepted this explanation with the resilience that continued to amaze him. She'd already survived more upheaval in her young life than most adults experienced in decades, developing an adaptability that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, after Ivy had been settled into one of the bedrooms with promises that everything would be normal again soon, Kieran sat with Celeste and explained the situation in terms that conveyed the seriousness without terrifying her unnecessarily. His employer was unhappy with recent changes in priorities. Threats had been made against people who mattered to him. Resolution would require methods that she might find disturbing but were necessary for their long-term safety. "How dangerous are these people?" Celeste asked quietly. "The ones who are threatening us." "Dangerous enough that running won't solve the problem permanently," Kieran said. "They have resources, connections, and the kind of patience that makes them willing to wait months or years for the right opportunity. The only way to end this is to end them." The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but clearly understood. Celeste was intelligent enough to recognize what he was telling her without forcing him to spell out the violence that would be required. She was also practical enough to understand that some problems couldn't be solved through negotiation or legal channels. "What do you need from me?" she asked finally, and the simple question revealed everything about why he'd fallen in love with her. No hysteria, no demands for impossible guarantees. Just a straightforward request for information about how she could help protect their family. "I need you to stay here with Ivy and trust that I know how to handle this," he said. "The security system will keep you safe while I deal with the source of the problem. And after tonight, we won't have to worry about Vincent Torino or anyone who works for him ever again." Celeste studied his face in the dim lighting of the safe house living room, seeing things there that probably should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. This was the man she'd been falling in love with, revealed in his full complexity, capable of tenderness and terrible violence, willing to be whatever was necessary to protect the people he claimed as his own. "Come back to us," she said simply, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. "Whatever you have to do out there, just make sure you come back to us." Kieran left the safe house at midnight, armed and armored for war against people who'd made the fatal mistake of threatening his family. The intelligence he'd gathered over the past few hours painted a clear picture of Vincent's intentions. A team of 6 men, professionals brought in from outside Charleston to handle what Vincent considered a discipline problem requiring permanent solution. They were gathered at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, planning their assault on what they believed was a defenseless apartment where a rogue enforcer's civilian family slept unprotected. The irony wasn't lost on Kieran. They'd underestimated him just as completely as he'd underestimated the transformative power of love. The confrontation was brief and decisive. 8 years of experience in violence, combined with intimate knowledge of his opponent's methods and the motivation of a man protecting everything that mattered to him, made the outcome inevitable. By dawn, Vincent Torino and his assassination team had become cautionary tales rather than active threats. Kieran returned to the safe house as the sun rose over Charleston, carrying the weight of what he'd done, but feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The external threat was eliminated. His family was safe, and for the first time since Ivy had approached him on that dark street, he could plan for a future that didn't require constant vigilance against enemies. Celeste was waiting for him in the kitchen, coffee already brewing and concern written across her features until she saw his face and realized that whatever had needed doing was finished. She didn't ask for details, understanding instinctively that some knowledge was too heavy for civilians to carry. Instead, she simply held him, letting her presence communicate what words couldn't about love surviving violence and family enduring external pressures. "Is it over?" she asked quietly against his chest. "It's over," he confirmed. "We can go home now. All of us." But even as he said it, Kieran knew that home had become something different than any physical location. Home was wherever Celeste and Ivy were safe and happy, wherever his presence brought comfort rather than danger. And for the first time in his adult life, he had the freedom to build that kind of home without worrying about enemies gathering in the shadows. Later that morning, as they packed their few belongings and prepared to return to normal life, Ivy approached him with her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched in her small arms. "Are the bad men gone?" she asked with the directness that characterized most of her questions about adult complications. "They're gone," Kieran assured her, kneeling down so they were at eye level. "And they won't ever bother us again. You're safe, your mom is safe, and we can go back to worrying about normal things like what to have for breakfast and which books to read before bedtime." Ivy nodded solemnly, accepting his promise with the trust that continued to humble him. "Good," she said simply. "I missed our regular house, and my stuffed animals were worried about being away from their proper beds." The matter-of-fact way she processed danger and resolution reminded Kieran that children were often more resilient than the adults who tried to protect them. Ivy had survived her father's abandonment, her mother's illness, and now threats from criminal organizations, emerging from each crisis stronger and more adaptable than before. Driving back through Charleston as the city awakened to another day, Kieran reflected on how completely his life had changed in just a few weeks. He'd gone from being Vincent's most reliable enforcer to a man whose primary concern was ensuring a 4-year-old had enough chocolate chip pancakes and bedtime stories. The transformation should have felt like weakness, but instead it felt like the first real strength he'd ever possessed. That afternoon, while Celeste napped and Ivy played with toys that had been waiting patiently for their return, Kieran made the phone calls necessary to transform his business interests from criminal enterprises to legitimate operations. Money laundering became investment consulting. Protection rackets became private security firms. Collections work became debt counseling services. It would take time to complete the transition, but he had resources and connections that would make the process smoother than most people attempting similar transformations. More importantly, he had motivation that went beyond mere survival or profit. He had a family to protect and a future to build that required legal income rather than criminal enterprise. When Celeste woke from her nap and found him working at her kitchen table surrounded by legal documents and business plans, she understood without explanation what he was doing. The grateful smile that spread across her face was worth more than all the money he'd made in 8 years of dangerous work. "You're really doing this," she said softly, walking away from all of it. "I'm walking towards something better," he corrected. "Something worth protecting without having to become the thing other people need protection from." That evening, as they settled back into their normal routines of dinner preparation and homework help and the 1,000 small intimacies that characterized family life, Kieran realized he'd found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Not just love or safety or belonging, but purpose that didn't require him to sacrifice his humanity in service of other people's greed. He was still dangerous, would always be dangerous to anyone who threatened the people he'd claimed as his own. But that danger was now focused and purposeful rather than random and profitable. He'd become someone worth being loved by, someone worthy of the trust that Ivy gave him every time she fell asleep in his arms, and Celeste showed him every time she chose to build a future that included him. The external threats were gone, eliminated with the kind of permanent finality that would discourage others from making similar mistakes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he worked to legitimize his business operations and build the kind of life that could give Celeste and Ivy everything they deserved. But tonight, with his family safe and his enemies defeated, Kieran Drake was exactly where he belonged. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Kieran found himself in the most unlikely position imaginable for a former enforcer, kneeling on the floor of Celeste's living room, carefully braiding Ivy's hair while she chattered about the butterflies she'd seen in the park that morning. His large hands, once instruments of violence, now moved with practiced gentleness through the silky strands that never seemed to stay in place for more than an hour. The transformation in their lives had been remarkable. The apartment building had been renovated from top to bottom, though Kieran had been careful to maintain its character while adding security features that were invisible but comprehensive. The broken steps had been replaced, the plumbing updated, and every unit brought up to standards that reflected his belief that everyone deserved to live with dignity. More importantly, his business empire had completed its metamorphosis from criminal enterprise to legitimate operation. What had once been money laundering was now investment consulting for small businesses. Former protection rackets had become security firms that actually protected their clients rather than creating the threats they charged to prevent. The transformation had cost him some income, but gained him something infinitely more valuable: the ability to sleep peacefully beside the woman he loved without worrying about what tomorrow's work might require. The legal adoption process for Ivy was nearly complete, a complex procedure that had required careful navigation of Charleston's family court system. Kieran's criminal record had been a complication, but his financial resources and the obvious bonds he'd formed with both mother and daughter had convinced the judge that this placement served the child's best interests. Soon, he would be not just the man who protected them, but officially and legally Ivy's father. "There," he said, finishing the braid and securing it with the butterfly hair tie that was currently her most prized possession. Perfect princess hair for a perfect princess. Ivy twisted to look at herself in the mirror Celeste held up, her face lighting with the kind of pure joy that still had the power to stop his breath. "You're the best daddy in the whole world," she announced with the absolute certainty that characterized most of her pronouncements about the people she loved. The word daddy still hit him with surprising force every time she used it. 3 months ago, he'd been a man who lived alone and expected to die alone, connected to no one and responsible for nothing beyond his own survival. Now he was someone's daddy, someone's foundation and protector and source of bedtime stories and butterfly hair ties. Celeste emerged from the kitchen where she'd been preparing their dinner, and Kieran felt the familiar surge of amazement that this beautiful, intelligent woman had chosen to build a life with him. She'd recovered completely from the pneumonia that had brought them together, but more than that, she'd blossomed in the security his protection provided. The constant worry that had characterized her features when they first met had been replaced by a serenity that made her even more beautiful than she'd been at the beginning. "Dinner's almost ready," she announced, then paused to admire Kieran's handiwork with Ivy's hair. "That looks lovely, sweetheart. Did you thank Daddy for doing such a good job?" "I thanked him lots," Ivy said solemnly. "And I told him he was the best daddy ever, which is true because he buys me pancakes and reads me stories and keeps all the scary things away." The simple summary of his role in her life encapsulated everything important about who he'd become: provider, protector, source of comfort and safety. It was a job description that would have seemed foreign and impossible just months earlier, but now felt like the only work that mattered. That evening, after Ivy had been bathed and read to and tucked into bed with her collection of stuffed animals, Kieran found himself alone with Celeste in the comfortable quiet of their living room. She was reading a novel while he pretended to work on legitimate business documents, but mostly he was watching her and marveling at the domestic peace that had replaced the constant tension of his former life. The ring had been burning a hole in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that might never come if he continued overthinking the situation. They'd been living as a family, loving as a family, building a future as a family. The only thing missing was the official recognition of what everyone who knew them already understood. "Celeste," he said quietly, setting aside his papers and moving to sit beside her on the couch. She looked up from her book, immediately sensing the change in his voice that indicated something significant was about to happen. Her dark eyes searched his face, finding whatever she was looking for in his expression and smiling with the kind of anticipation that suggested she'd been expecting this conversation. "I need to ask you something important," he continued, reaching into his pocket for the small velvet box that contained his hopes for their future. "But first, I need to tell you what you and Ivy have done for me, what you've given me that I didn't even know I needed." "Kieran," she said softly, her hand reaching to touch his face with the gentleness that had characterized all their interactions from the beginning. 3 months ago, I was a man who lived for violence and money, who had no connections to anything meaningful, no purpose beyond surviving until the next day," he said, his voice rough with emotions he was still learning to express. "I thought I was strong because I could hurt people, successful because I had money, protected because I was feared. But I was really just empty, just going through the motions of existing without any reason to care whether I lived or died. Celeste's eyes were bright with tears, but she remained silent, understanding that he needed to say these words as much as she needed to hear them. Then Ivy looked at me like I might be someone worth trusting, and you looked at me like I might be someone worth loving. And suddenly I discovered that everything I thought I knew about strength and success and protection was wrong. He continued. Real strength is being gentle with people who need gentleness. Real success is building something meaningful with people you love. Real protection is creating a safe space where the people you care about can flourish. He pulled the ring box from his pocket, opening it to reveal the diamond that had taken him weeks to choose, because nothing seemed worthy of the woman who'd transformed his entire understanding of what life could be. I'm not the man I was when we met, he said quietly. I'm better, stronger, more complete because you and Ivy taught me how to be human instead of just surviving. Will you marry me, Celeste? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the family you've given me? The silence that followed felt eternal, though it probably lasted only seconds. Celeste stared at the ring, at his face, at the life they'd built together that was now waiting for her response to determine its future direction. Yes, she whispered, then louder, with the kind of joy that filled the entire room. Yes, of course, yes. I love you, Kieran. I love the man you've become, the father you are to Ivy, the future we're building together. When he slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with all the gratitude and love and hope he'd been carrying for months, Kieran felt something settle into place that he'd never experienced before. Completeness. Belonging. The absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with exactly the people he was meant to love and protect for the rest of his life. The wedding planning became a family project that consumed their evenings and weekends with the kind of happy chaos that Kieran had never imagined wanting to be part of. Ivy took her role as flower girl with the seriousness of someone who'd been entrusted with crucial responsibilities, practicing her petal-throwing technique and helping choose decorations that would make the ceremony beautiful enough for what she considered the most important day in their family's history. They decided on a small ceremony in Charleston's historic district, surrounded by the people who'd become their chosen family over the past months. Marcus Reed, the restaurant owner whose life Kieran had changed by showing mercy instead of violence, would cater the reception. Rebecca, the nurse who'd cared for Celeste during her hospitalization, would be matron of honor. And Ivy would stand beside them as they promised to love and protect each other for the rest of their lives. The adoption papers were finalized 1 week before the wedding, making Kieran officially and legally what he'd been in his heart since the night Ivy had trusted him with her mother's life. Father, provider, protector. The man responsible for ensuring this remarkable little girl grew up knowing she was loved unconditionally and safe absolutely. Standing in the courthouse with Ivy in his arms and Celeste beside him, listening to the judge declare their family legally recognized and permanent, Kieran felt a completeness he'd never imagined possible. This was what success really looked like. Not money or fear or power over others, but the simple knowledge that 3 people were better off because he existed, safer because he loved them, happier because he'd learned to be worthy of their trust. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of Charleston sunshine that made everything look like it had been painted in golden watercolors. Kieran stood at the altar in a suit that cost more than most people's cars, but all he could think about was how lucky he was to be marrying the woman who'd taught him the difference between existing and living. When Celeste walked down the aisle in a dress that made her look like something from a fairy tale, with Ivy beside her scattering rose petals with artistic precision, Kieran felt his throat close with emotions that would have embarrassed him in his former life, but now seemed like the most natural thing in the world. The ceremony was simple and perfect, filled with promises that carried the weight of lives that had been transformed by unexpected love. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Kieran kissed his bride while Ivy cheered and their small gathering of friends applauded, he knew that every mistake he'd made and every terrible thing he'd done had been worth it if it led him to this moment. The reception was held in the garden behind the church, with Marcus's incredible food and Rebecca's carefully planned decorations creating an atmosphere of celebration that reflected the joy of 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds. Ivy danced with every adult present, her butterfly hair tie slightly askew, but her happiness absolutely radiant. Later, much later, when the guests had gone home, and Ivy had finally been convinced to go to sleep despite her excitement, Kieran stood on the small balcony of their hotel suite with his arms around his wife, looking out over the Charleston skyline that had been the backdrop for their entire love story. "Do you ever miss it?" Celeste asked quietly. "Your old life, I mean. The excitement, the power, the money." Kieran considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he'd been just months earlier. That version of himself felt like a stranger now, someone whose priorities and definitions of success seemed alien to who he'd become. "Never," he said honestly. That life was about taking things from people, controlling them through fear, surviving at the expense of everyone else. This life is about building something meaningful, protecting the people I love, leaving the world better than I found it. There's no comparison. 6 months later, Celeste's announcement that they were expecting their first child together sent Kieran into a state of joy and terror that lasted for weeks. The idea of being responsible for another tiny human being, of helping create and nurture a life from the very beginning, felt both miraculous and overwhelming. Ivy's reaction was unqualified excitement about becoming a big sister, combined with detailed plans for teaching the baby important skills like proper stuffed animal arrangement and the best techniques for making daddy laugh. Her enthusiasm helped calm Kieran's nerves about his ability to be a good father to a child he'd known from birth rather than rescued from crisis. On a warm evening in their first summer as a married family, Kieran sat on their front porch with Ivy curled against his side and Celeste reading beside him, one hand resting on the barely visible curve that would become their son or daughter. The scene was so perfectly domestic, so completely normal, that it still surprised him sometimes to realize this was his life. "Daddy," Ivy said suddenly, looking up at him with the serious expression she wore when pondering important questions. "Are you happy?" The question was so direct, so fundamentally important, that it deserved complete honesty. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible," he told her. "Happier than I knew people could be. And it's all because you and Mama taught me what really matters." "Good," she said with satisfaction, settling back against his chest. "Because I want you to be happy forever and ever, just like in the stories where everyone lives happily ever after." Looking around at his front porch, his pregnant wife, his adopted daughter who'd saved his life by trusting him with hers, Kieran Drake realized that he was indeed living in a story where everyone lived happily ever after. It was just that the everyone included a former killer who'd learned that the strongest men were those gentle enough to braid little girls' hair and wise enough to know that the most important battles were fought to protect love rather than acquire power. The man who'd once measured success by the fear he inspired now measured it by the laughter in his home, the trust in his family's eyes, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more opportunities to be worthy of the love he'd been given. And for the first time in his life, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything.